voice. Okay, good. So thank you for the introduction. I will be talking about the necessity and essentiality of origin, and whether an object ontologically depends on its origin. So whether it depends for its existence on its origin or not. I will first give a very brief introduction into the topic and the debates motivated by this is a nice or an interesting presentation. Then I will present an argument, the necessity arguments, and then I will try to argue that there is this ontological dependence on your origin. So first, the central question in this debate is whether an object could have had a radically different origin than it in fact has. So an example is a table made from wood. Could it have been made from ice and still be the same table? Or is it then a different table? And what I will focus on in this presentation is whether a person could have originated from different sperm and egg cell or not. And what is interesting about this debate is that intuitions clash. People's intuitions clash on whether your origin is essential or necessary to your existence or not. So Saul Kripke blew life into this debate again, and he gave an argument based on intuition. So he said, if a person looks exactly like the Queen of England, acts in exactly the same way as the Queen of England, but has different parents, is this the Queen of England, or someone who looks like the Queen of England and acts like the Queen of England? He said, well, clearly we would never say this is then the Queen of England. It's someone who looks like her. So origin, he says, is necessary. It's a metaphysical necessity, your origin. But then people responded and said, well, I don't share this intuition at all. So arguments had to be provided to further argue for this. And arguments have been provided, mainly focused on the uniqueness of origin and sufficiency of origin. But they have problems, and they are not generally accepted as convincing. And what I would like to do here is present a different kind of argument, and thereby avoiding sort of the classical problems with this issue. So the basic idea, and in the light of scientific integrity, I have to say that it was casually mentioned during a lecture by Kevin Mulligan, and I wanted to see whether it would work, and if so, what it would look like. So that is this presentation. So the basic idea is that I depend for my existence on the fact that I have been born, and the fact that I have been born depends for its existence on the fact that I have been conceived. And finally, the fact that I've been conceived depends for its existence on my parents. Therefore, I have to depend for my existence on my parents. So that is the basic idea, which I will try to further elaborate on. I will first provide a necessity argument, so argue that origin must be necessary, with an argument along the same lines as this basic idea. And it centers around two events that are important. So the birth event, event B, that is the event where I am born, and event C, that is the event where I am conceived, so where my father's sperm cell fertilizes my mother's egg cell. And for the birth event, there are many different birth events, because I could have been born in a hospital instead of at home. I could have been born earlier or later. I could have been born by a cesarean section or with the use of a vacuum pump. And these are all different events, but they are all events where I am born. So there are all these different birth events, but they are all events where I am born. So this is important. And the same goes for event C, the conception events. So now the arguments first, for each of these conception events, it's necessary that they exist only if my parents exist, or better to say, they exist only if my father's sperm cell exists and my mother's egg cell exists. Then secondly, necessarily each birth event exists only if some conception event exists. So it does not rely on a specific conception event, but for me to have been born, it's necessary that there is some conception there, some conception events. And finally, necessarily I exist only if some birth event exists. So not a specific birth event, not the actual birth event, but some birth event. And this leads to the conclusion that necessarily I exist only if my parents exist, and so that there is necessity of origin. Now, why accept these three premises? I don't have strict arguments, but more reasons. So for the first, I have repeated the arguments in the corner. So necessarily each conception event exists only if my parents exist. Well, this is because events rigidly depend on their participants. Consider the assassination of Caesar. If Caesar does not exist, then you cannot have the assassination of Caesar. Likewise, you cannot have the events where my father's sperm cell fertilizes my mother's egg cell without my father's sperm cell and my mother's egg cell. Very straightforward. Then for the second, that necessarily each birth event exists only if some conception event exists. This is focused on the contrapositive. So if no conception would take place, then I can also not be born. So Joyce says that the moment of conception is the point at which a person definitely begins to exist physically in the space-time world. Well, if there's no such moment, if there's no such point at which a person begins to exist in the space-time world, well, then they also cannot be born, is the idea. And finally, for the third premise, necessarily I exist only if some birth event exists. Well, this is by the fact that we are mammals. It's not possible to exist outside of the womb, at least, without being born in some way. So this is the main idea here. But in general, a necessary connection, in this case between you and your origin, does not imply ontological dependence. If you have two not facts, but two truths that are necessarily true, then there is a necessary connection between them. Because if the one exists, the other must also exist, and the other way around. But they don't depend on each other in any way. So in general, a necessary connection does not imply ontological dependence. This is something that needs to be argued for in addition. So that will be the remainder of this presentation. And there are two accounts of ontological dependence, the modal existential account and the essential account. And I would like to show that on both accounts, if you have this necessary connection, then there's also this ontological dependence. So this is the first account. Don't freak out, it's not so difficult. So there are two different types of existential dependence. There's rigid dependence and generic dependence. And for the first, something depends for its existence on some other particular thing. Well, with generic dependence, it does not depend on a particular thing, but rather on something of a certain kind, or not per se kind, some F. And rigid existential dependence is defined as necessarily X exists only if Y exists. An example is a set and its members. A set only exists if its members exist. If there are different members, the set must also be different. The set cannot exist anymore. Also, with the assassination of Caesar, this event cannot exist if Caesar does not exist. So a set depends on its members rigidly, and also the assassination of Caesar rigidly depends on Caesar. Generic dependence is defined as necessarily X exists only if some F exists. So an example is a living organism and its cells. A living organism is composed of cells, or have to be cells, but you also change your cells, you constantly change them. So you don't depend on particular cells, but there have to be some cells. And likewise for electricity, you need electrons for electricity, but not particular electrons, just some electrons to be there, many, but not particular ones. And using these definitions, we can we have this new argument in terms of dependence, where any conception event rigidly depends on my parents, or their sperm and egg cell at least. Any birth event depends for its existence on conception events, and I generically depends on a birth event. And this leads to the conclusion that I rigidly depends for my existence on my parents. So I don't need some parents to exist, but I need my parents and their sperm and egg to exist for me to exist. But there are problems with this modal existential account of dependence. And the main problem is that there are cases of asymmetrical dependence, which this cannot account for because it will be cases of symmetric dependence on this account. So an example is Socrates on singleton Socrates, that is the set that contains only Socrates. By definition of the set depends on its members and exists as soon as its members exist. So necessarily it's the case that if singleton Socrates exists, Socrates must also exist, but also the other way around. If Socrates exists, the singleton Socrates also immediately exists. If you then apply the definitions of modal existential dependence, there must be this symmetric dependence relation, but this is clearly false, because Socrates does not depend for its existence on this set, this singleton Socrates. It's rather the other way around, that singleton Socrates depends on Socrates. So this account cannot account for this asymmetry, so we need a more fine-grained notion of ontological dependence. And we need that on this account, there is this ontological dependence on your origin. So essential dependence is a more fine-grained notion, so hopefully we will have the result we want. On the essential account, you also have this distinction between dependence on a particular y and some f, so generic dependence, and they are defined in terms of essence instead of necessity. So for the first one, it's part of the essence of x, that x exists only if y exists, so only if a particular y exists. So this is the case with Socrates and singleton Socrates. Singleton Socrates exists only if Socrates exists, not the other way around. So here we have this asymmetry. And this expresses individual essence. And for generic dependence, an example is water and H2O. So water is part of the essence of water, that it exists only if some H2O molecules exist. And this expresses this more generic essence or general essence of natural kinds. But see here that dependence is defined in terms of essence and what is part of the essence of X. So it's assumed we already know somehow what is part of the essence of X. But how do we know this? So Lowe says its very being, its identity is what makes it the thing that it is, and thereby distinct from any other thing. And that is its essence. And to know something's essence is simply to understand what exactly that thing is. But this is supposed to be somehow immediately clear. So he gives the example as part of the very being of a material being that it is spatially extended. This is supposed to be immediately clear, but sometimes things are not immediately clear. For example, with origin, there's debate about is this part of the essence of an object or not? So we're kind of stuck here because if we don't know if it's part of the essence, we don't know if it's a part of this, if there's this ontological dependence relation. But what we do know is that there is this necessary connection if the argument works. So maybe that can help us. Because what on this account of essential dependence, it's supposed to tell us what the source of this necessary connection is supposed to be. So why there is this necessary connection? With singleton Socrates and Socrates, the source of this necessary connection is singleton Socrates and not Socrates itself. So Fine says a metaphysical necessity has its source in the essence of object with which it implicitly deals. And Vrije says that statements are metaphysically necessary insofar as they are true in virtue of the nature or essence of some objects. So if there is this metaphysical necessity, it must be because of some essential fact, because of the essence of the objects involved. Now, if we have this necessary connection between you and your origin, what is then the source of this necessity? Well, it cannot be that you are essential to your origin. If you look at the case of the wooden table, it's false to say that the table is essential to the piece of wood, because the wood could have been made into a chair, into a cupboard, into a floor, into a door. It need not have resulted in a table. So the table is not essential to the piece of wood. And likewise for people, you are not essential to your origin, because your origin did not have resulted in you. Maybe the sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, but then there was this fatal multiplication error and it decomposed, and no person evolved out of the zygote. Or maybe the zygote split into two, and then one of the two died off. But it's a matter of chance which of the two has, for example, fatal multiplication error. So it's really a matter of chance which of the two then grows into this full human being. So also here, you are not essential to your origin, it seems to be. So if there is this necessary connection between you and your origin, it must be because your origin is essential to you and not the other way around. So there is this essentiality of origin. And by the definition of essential dependence, this must mean there is this essential existential dependence on your origin. Okay, so that was it. This is the argument again, maybe nice also for the discussion or for the Q&A. So I try to argue that there is this necessity of origin, and by both main accounts of ontological dependence, the conclusion must be that if there is this necessity of origin, then there's also ontological dependence on your origin.
No, that was great. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes.
I have one question, because from the onset I was wondering what do people argue who don't agree that something has a necessary origin?
Well, I'd say it's a year ago that I wrote the paper, so I'm not exactly sure I can remember their points. So I think it's also a bit for the sake of argument that they want to see, okay, I'll show it then. But yeah, I think, yeah, so I'm not entirely sure. So the counter arguments for the argument that are there are really focused on that the principles that are used do not give you the result you want. So not per se, like there's not this necessity of origin, but this argument does not work to achieve it, at least.
Yeah.
But there are people who say I just don't have this intuition, or what they say is also that this sperm cell and this egg cell are not specifically necessary, because maybe in the future we can do all this stuff with
Make a person from nothing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. So that we can make cells ourselves, that we can make a sperm cell, make an egg cell maybe, and that we don't. So in that sense, you don't depend on
Parents.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? So I was wondering, doesn't this argument work only given certain assumptions about human beings? For instance, naturalistic or materialistic. So suppose you're a Platonist about persons. So suppose I believe I had a pre-birth existence. Right, that's what Plato believed.
Yeah.
Then, this birth event isn't essential to my existence because I already existed prior to my birth. So that would be.
Yeah, it depends on what you view as then you. Like in this argument, what is it a material being you are considering, or more the spirit, maybe?
So that's what I was saying. Doesn't your argument only work on a certain assumption, namely that a person is a physical object? Doesn't it assume physicalism about persons?
Well, it at least assumes that maybe that, I don't know. I think it focuses on the physical person. Yes.
Okay.
At least.
Right. So
maybe there is also the spirit.
So,
It could
so
be
yesterday
related-
I heard you say that you had some sympathy for dualism.
Yes, yes, so
Uh,
this focuses on the material human being. Yeah.
Right, and then the question is, where does I, when I use the word I, refer to? Does it refer to my body, or does it?
I think in this sense, if you look then at the Queen of England's points,
Yeah.
if you want to distinguish between who is the Queen of England and who is not, then you can say, okay, well, this person has this origin. So in that sense, I think so. I think in that sense, that it's very relevant then to know what makes the human being who is present on this earth.
I see your point. There was someone there. Yeah.
But maybe this is just a lack of understanding, but why is in the first premise, is it each event C exists only if my parents exist, and why isn't it if some parents exist? Because it seems to me
But if you remember, so the conception event is the event where my father's sperm cell fertilizes my mother's egg cell. So, and then remember that for each event, they rigidly depend on their participants. So you need the participants to be there for it to be the same event. So if you have, if you consider different sperm cell and a different egg cell, you have a different event. And so you have different conception events in this argument, but they are all events with this specific sperm cell and this specific egg cell involved. It would also be strange if it would say here, for each conception event, some parents have to exist, because then anyone could be my origin, any parents. So that you also don't want this, I guess.
that was my thought, that as a kind of the conclusion just kind of assumed in the first premise, but maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Sebastian.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk, and I do have a lot of questions. So I have one question that is kind of similar. Maybe I'm just confused, but so I was wondering whether the argument doesn't just depend on assumptions about human beings, but just about laws of nature as well. Because I mean, I could be a swamp person, right? So in the sense of, you know, there's an example of swamp man who just lightning strikes a swamp and then spontaneously a curtain is created, right? So that could be me, right? So a swamp man isn't born.
Yeah, I was also thinking about this. I think it does depend on these features of what makes a human being. But I think that is in this context maybe also okay if you're talking about like essences, maybe like what is essential to being a human being. I think there you can make assumptions that they don't like just spontaneously start to exist, but that they are mammals, for example, and that they have sort of grow out of this process. But yeah, so yeah, I think
Well,
I'm just not essentially a human being, right? That's so my.
yeah, of course.
Well, no,
But
no,
if
no,
it-
no, no, because I think so. So the thing I was, so I mean, it is possible that, I mean, obviously I'm not a swamp person. I was actually born, right? But I could have been swamp. Like I can imagine the situation.
Could you?
exactly like-
That is the point, because I don't think.
but
I don't
you
think
could-
so.
I mean, you could. I mean, just
Could you
suppose-
also have been a frog?
Imagine my parents revealed to me, oh, you were never born. We found you in a swamp. You are a swamp person, right? That's not a, I mean, obviously that's weird because the laws of nature don't work like that. But it's not like, I don't think it's like inconceivable.
Okay, yeah, that could be. I think, yeah, this argument is focused on human beings. That's true. So I was thinking about, okay, but you also want origin for a wooden table. That the wood is part of its origin. So you want it more to be more general. But I think for each kind, maybe you can have this sort of argument, maybe. If this line of argument works, then I think for each kinds, you can maybe have this line of arguments.
okay, Richard.
Well, you could just say it's essential to you that you're a swan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That example doesn't upset the idea of necessity of origin. What I wanted to ask though was, I mean, to what extent do you need two arguments, because the modal essential dependence argument and the essential was the reason why you needed those two arguments just because of the Socrates case and the sect?
Yeah.
Right, so a Platonist, like me, in this case, can come along and say, well, I actually think it is essential to Socrates. It's the thing which contains Socrates. There's a necessary connection running in both directions. If you said that, then you could just simplify it down to one. Okay, that's all I want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you had your hand up.
I forgot. Sorry.
Any other questions?
Oh, I remember now.
Well, you're too late now.
Like
No, I'm joking. Go on.
I just was interested because I was just curious what inspired you to start thinking about this in the first place. It doesn't really relate to any particular part of the presentation. Always curious to know what inspires people to do their research.
Well, so it was proposed by Kevin Mulligan, sort of this general idea of having this birth and this conception. But I do think it's a very interesting debate because I really like to focus. I really like this very abstract metaphysics, but still based on intuitions. And I think in this debate it's super interesting that the intuitions clash a bit. But I do think I have a strong intuition that you have to have this origin for you to exist. So that is why I like to delve into it a bit. Yeah.
Right. So a final point on my part. So suppose you adopt a possible world metaphysics. So you think there are these uncountably many possible worlds. Now there is the actual world in which you are born out of your parents. It was you were a participant in a birth event.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many possible worlds. Can there be one or a couple of them in which you exist, but not your parents?
Oh, I don't think so. No.
So that's right. That's the correct answer on your view. At least then your body wouldn't exist,
Yeah, exactly.
or that body wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, thanks very much.